I studied a moment ago. I studied a year ago. I studied alone. I studied with my friends. I studied as quickly as possible. I studied as loudly as possible. I studied before I went to school. I studied before I went to Chennai. I studied before lunch. I studied before the dinner. I studied by myself. I studied with the help of my mother. I studied earlier. I studied after. I studied after lunch. I studied after dinner. I studied after I came home. I studied after my father came home. I studied slowly. I studied fast. I studied rapidly. I studied very slowly. I studied very fast. I studied hurriedly. I studied every day during my holidays. I studied every evening in the summer. I studied every 3 days. I studied for about an hour. I studied for a few hours every week. I studied for a few minutes. I studied for a few hours. I studied for 2 hours. I studied for a long time. I studied for 2 months last year. I studied for 2 months last year. I studied like crazy, but I got less marks. I studied like crazy, but I got less marks. I studied like crazy, so I got good marks. I studied like crazy, so I got good marks. I studied reluctantly, so I failed the exam. I studied reluctantly, so I failed the exam. I studied several times. I studied for several years. I studied then. I studied 2 years ago. I studied yet one more answer. I studied yet one more lesson. I studied till 8 every morning. I studied till I went to bed. I studied until my father came home. I studied until the power went out. I studied at school. I studied at the house. I studied again. I studied again and again. I studied all day. I studied happily. I studied enthusiastically. I studied reluctantly. I studied patiently. I studied intermittently. I studied without rest. I studied and then wrote it. I studied and then went to sleep. I studied and then had my dinner. I studied and then watched TV. I studied English and Tamil. I studied both English and Tamil. I studied quickly but correctly. I studied slowly but correctly. I studied and wrote daily. I studied during the lunchtime. I studied nicely yesterday, otherwise, I can't write the exam well now. I studied nicely yesterday, otherwise, I can't write the exam well now. I studied nicely yesterday, else, I can't write the exam well now. I studied nicely yesterday, else, I can't write the exam well now. I studied yesterday, because I have an exam today. I studied quickly today, since I didn't study yesterday. I studied quickly today, because I didn't study yesterday. I neither studied nor wrote. Yesterday I studied. I eventually studied. Not only I studied, but I also wrote. I was sick. Yet I studied. In spite of having a fever, I studied. Despite having a fever, I studied. Though I had a fever, I studied. Even though I had a fever, I studied. Although I had a fever, I studied. Besides playing, I studied nicely yesterday. Besides playing, I studied nicely yesterday. Finally, I studied. However, I studied. Anyway, I studied. Anyhow, I studied.